I will go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon and welcome to the first of the weekly series in biology seminar series. Today we have Randy Wilson from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I will introduce Dr. Manus, who will give him a better introduction. I just wanted to let everybody know that there are 37 people viewing this right now. You can't see each other, but you are here. At any point you have questions, type them into the Q&A section on the WebEx platform. And when we conclude the lecture part of it, we will go through that, and Dr. Manus and I will ask the questions to Mr. Wilson so that we can try to get all your questions answered. So don't be shy and put your questions in there. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Manus.
Okay. Hi. So I'm really pleased to introduce Randy Wilson today. He received a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Management from Tennessee Technological University and a Master of Science in Ecology from the University of Memphis. He currently serves as station leader for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Migratory Bird Field Station. It's in Jackson, Mississippi, where he provides technical assistance to a variety of state, federal, NGO partners about bird habitat issues across the Southeast. And prior to joining the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Randy worked for the U.S. Geological Society at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, conducting management-based research, investigating bird response to forest management and restoration activities in bottomland hardwood forests across the Mississippi alluvial valley. So welcome, Randy Wilson.
All right, with that, thank you. You hear me okay there, Terry? Am I coming
Yes.
through okay? Thanks for that intro, and yes, thanks for the invite to participate and share a little bit of insight around what I do as a migratory bird biologist, and maybe a little bit more about what the Fish and Wildlife Service does with respect to migratory birds. So I kind of got a lot of material to cover here, but I'll kind of run through all of it, and I'll hopefully have time at the end for any sort of questions and Q&A we have. And so what I wanted to do is kind of break down the agenda a little bit with a little bit of intro about the Fish and Wildlife Service, kind of a bigger picture and where the MigBird program fits within that, and then start kind of drilling into specific examples of kind of activities that we undertake within the program, and then to conclude with an effort that we're undertaking in the Gulf of Mexico that Terry's been involved in over the last few years as well, and then at the end give you a little bit of information about some internships that are available with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So if you're interested in working for us on one of our refuges or within the MigBird program, we'd love to have you and bring you on board. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Click. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is one of the oldest federal conservation entities or agencies within the government. It was created in 1871. It's gone through several name changes to get to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as it's known today. And it's the only agency that has the full responsibility of managing for fish and wildlife populations. There's other ones like the Forest Service, etc., that do a lot of good for fish and wildlife resources, but they're primarily a forestry-based agency. So the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service is to work with others to protect, conserve, enhance fish and wildlife populations and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. That's what we do on a daily basis. And so kind of where we work, we're across the entirety of the United States, of course. Administratively, we're broken into 12 regions. Used to be 9 regions. We just recently revamped and redrew all the lines on the map. Those of us here in Mississippi, Louisiana, we're in the Mississippi Basin, which now runs basically all the way to the upper Miss, where the Mississippi begins, all the way to the coast. And so the next couple of slides I'll apologize for. There's not a good way of presenting this. So I just kind of had to make some org charts the best I could. But within the Fish and Wildlife Service, there's a whole lot of different activities and kind of bureaus and divisions, from wildlife sport, fishery restoration, our refuges, fisheries, migratory birds, ecological services, etc. You can read all of them across the top there. But mainly I wanted to kind of stay within the migratory bird program. At the national level, there's two different divisions. There's the Division of Migratory Bird Management and the Division of Bird Habitat Conservation. Now, these differ in that the Migratory Bird Management branch is kind of the regulatory piece of it. That's where a lot of the survey work is done, data management. If you're familiar with flyways, like the Mississippi Flyway, Atlantic Flyway, we have representatives and people who work within those kind of entities or forums. So that's all under the Bird Management box. Division of Bird Habitat Conservation is more of grants management. This is where North American Waterfowl, North American Wetlands Conservation Act, and then the Migratory Bird Conservation Act, they live and reside under this program or this division. Science and planning, we have national coordinators for all the primary bird initiatives, songbirds, waterfowl, etc., as well as our bird habitat joint ventures are embedded in this box. And then the federal duck stamp is managed under this division. So if we kind of flip this around and look from the regional perspective, we have one migratory bird program. Within that, there's kind of three divisions. We don't really call them divisions because if you count all of us up, we total about 20 people. So we didn't see the need to have divisions of 3 people per se. So we kind of separated that out. There's 4 ladies who deal with all the migratory bird permitting issues, the regulatory stuff. There's migratory bird field offices, such as myself. There's 3 of us, and I have a person who works for me in Florida who I would consider a field station. So there's really 4 of us that are field stations, and then our bird habitat joint ventures. And so kind of that linkage, right? You can see we go every which way. We're trying to help shepherd several different aspects of the national MigBird program. So we kind of have our hands full, and our jobs kind of vary, depends on what the issues are in the region, like in Mississippi, Louisiana versus the Atlantic coast or peninsular Florida. So what I wanted to do today is kind of start with the bird habitat joint ventures, and then talk briefly about the field stations and maybe some stuff that I'm involved in. The permitting stuff is a whole other conversation. That'd be another whole 45-minute kind of lecture. If we want to know more and dive into that, I'd be glad to get the right people on the phone or on the online to walk through those sort of conversations. So the joint ventures, the migratory bird habitat joint ventures, as I refer to them, there's 22 of them across the United States. Plus there's 3 species-based JVs that focus on black ducks, Arctic geese, and sea ducks. And as you can see from the map, what we like to call is that we're now wall-to-wall joint ventures. There's no white space. For a long time, joint ventures, when they first started, there was 12 original ones. So there was a lot of white space being places across the United States that were not covered under a joint venture type partnership. And so now we're wall-to-wall JVs. And here, you folks there in North Louisiana, and me just right down the road across the state line, we reside within the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture partnership. And so what is a joint venture? These are basically, they're self-directed, non-regulatory partnerships that have come together to implement, the national and international bird conservation plans. But basically, they're just a forum by which the conservation community, the federal agencies, state wildlife agencies, NGOs, etc., can come together and develop a shared vision of what we want that landscape to look like and how we should go about accomplishing that. And since joint ventures were they were created out of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, I'll walk through an example of how we stepped down and what we're doing, the advanced waterfowl planning here in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. And so really, when it comes to stepping those objectives down, we're talking about establishing habitat objectives and then figuring out an allocation scheme that links those habitat objectives to the habitat sources, meaning like, how do you get habitat objectives, or what's the values of those? And I'll get more into details on that in the next slide. And once we have that, how do we apportion those objectives out across the different management entities across the Mississippi Alluvial Valley? So looking at establishment of habitat objectives, So it's really, at the fundamental premise, it's an energy supply, energy demand equation. On the wintering grounds, all the literature and research suggests that food is a limiting factor. And so we use this supply and demand kind of dichotomy to base all of our planning from. To think about it a little bit more, so the energy demand comes from how many birds are overwintering in this geography, and then for how long are they staying? Are they staying for 30 days, 100 days? If they're here for 100 days and there's 5 million of them, well, 5 million times 100 days, it means how many ducks you have to feed for that period of time. So then you flip that equation around. What's the energy supply? How much habitat do we have on the ground? What's the carrying capacity? How much food resources are being produced by that habitat type? So the allocating of those objectives. So kind of ignore the green box for a second. That's just kind of the equation, how we get to the end game. You can see we've taken all the different sources of habitat, whether it be moist soil, agricultural crops, both harvested and unharvested, and then like naturally flooded or GTRs, you know, the managed bottomland hardwoods that we put water on. Each of those provides some food level of food resources or energy values for wintering waterfowl. And so there's a lot of research that came up with the food availability numbers, more research, you know, what's the kilocalories required to support a duck for one day, and then you can use that to generate a metric. So simple terms here, so 1 acre of moist soil habitats would support 1,868 mallard-sized ducks for one day, if that makes sense. So once we kind of know that, then we can think about how do we apportion those habitat objectives. So remember, we have all these different habitat sources. Those occur through naturally flooding, private lands, and public lands. We need to think about the relative contributions of those three sources of habitats across the landscape. So if you look at this kind of schematic, so at the MAV scale, our math suggests we need right at 470 million duck energy days. So how do we portion those out? Well, there's a lot of math that goes through using midwinter waterfowl estimates and so forth to figure out that Arkansas should be responsible for about 220 million. And then within that, here's the breakdown of natural flood, public and private. And then within public, state and federal agencies are responsible for their respective shares. And we've gone actually one step further and allocated these down to individual refuges and state wildlife management areas. So now that local manager has a target by which they can shoot for. They know, hey, I got to provide 10 million duck energy days somehow or another on my refuge this year. So it provides a basis by which management can justify their existence. And then it also provides a means of us to evaluate how well we're doing toward providing energy and food resources for wintering waterfowl. All right, so just because you have food on the landscape doesn't mean it's available. You have to have water, and then water is influenced by duration and frequency. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out the performance values associated with the water management unit. And so to get to that, we've defaulted to using either satellite imagery or aerial photography, whichever is the most available to us at the time. Here's an example from some satellite imagery. So all the dark blue is water, this brownish stuff is forest. Just as a frame of reference, these are the ag lands, kind of lighter tan. So through GIS remote sensing techniques, we can classify all the water, and then the red polygons represent water management units that we know about on private lands, and in some cases on public lands, wherever they may fall here. And so now lets us to look at things like this unit here had 100% performance, and there's other units 0% performance. So now you ask yourself, all right, what's going on over these units? So now if I go meet with a landowner or a manager, hey, how come there's no water in that unit? There's no water, basically you have no duck food. So it allows us to do those sort of assessments across the entirety of the landscape. So then, once we kind of have that, then we kind of start turning our attention more into kind of the technical assistance aspects. So one of the things that I do in my day job is to provide technical assistance to landowners as well as our managers in the state and federal lands So if they are growing a moist soil unit or an ag field, in this case, this is a rice impoundment in one of our refuges, you know, how's the water management flows? What's the regime to maximize not only rice production, but also benefits to other critters such as, you know, king rails. We found a lot of king rails in here. So now we're doubling down on our habitat benefits. So we're providing food resources for wintering waterfowl, but it's also a good food resource and habitat for other species as well. And then kind of switching gears a little bit, kind of getting out of the waterfowl arena. We also do a lot of technical assistance around forest management. Many of the priority birds that we have are what we call disturbance dependent. They live within forested systems, but they typically require some sort of disturbance to have early successional habitat within inside of a forest plot, such as, you know, Kentucky warblers, Swainson's warblers, things of that. And then also the American woodcock, right? He kind of gets left out of the conversation a little bit, because although he's technically, here's a trivia question, technically a shorebird that lives in the forest, right? But he's a managed species because he's a game species. It's actually a hunted population. So a lot of energy of my effort goes into, you know, forest management type activities and providing technical assistance. And as Terry said in my intro, this is kind of where I cut my teeth at White River National Wildlife Refuge, looking at forest bird response to forest management activities. And it's not just that, but it's also our ability to grow more forest. Most of you, if you've been out running around, at least in the Delta region, you know, you're familiar with, you know, wetland reserve program and the programs that we have to restore forested wetlands across the landscape. Here, this individual is, you know, replanting longleaf pine. If we ever hope to get more longleaf, something big and beautiful and pretty like the picture here, you know, that benefits things like backman sparrows, red-cockaded woodpeckers, whippoorwills, etc. You know, so we got to start at ground zero. There's a lot of technical assistance and research activities going on around how do you grow a forest from ground up? When do you implement prescribed fire regimes, etc. So some of the, I mean, it's all fun, but some of the more fun stuff to me is actually getting out and actually catching birds, having birds in hand. We do this for not just for the fun of it, but we do it for research activities, and here also for harvest regulations, especially with waterfowl. The banding data is one of the primary sources of information used to establish harvest regs or the waterfowl seasons every year. So having these band returns is critical information for the Fish and Wildlife Service to set harvest regs going forward. So I'm staying on that kind of research and monitoring tone for a minute. We also participate in helping researchers and other colleagues to develop surveys to assess, might be, you know, information bird related on a refuge or a WMA. Here, this is an effort I was recently involved in where we surveyed seabirds around the entirety of the northern Gulf of Mexico, from the Mexico-US border all the way around to Key West and dry Tortugas. So there's a pretty elaborate survey design to figure out how best to, you know, statistically and in a rigorous fashion assess seabird abundance across that big of a footprint. And then again, the fun part is you actually get to get in the plane and actually go fly the surveys as well. This is one of the Fish and Wildlife Service's aircraft. We have 5 of these, I think. These are Kodiak amphibious aircraft. These are awesome. And so a quick sidebar here, one of your alum from La Tech, Garrett Wilkerson, is now a Fish and Wildlife Service employee and flies one of these aircraft. So pretty cool linkage back to your university there, the program you've developed. All right, so totally kind of pivoting and switching gears a little bit. This is the effort I mentioned. You know, Terry's been involved in this. It's been a whole bunch of people across the Southeast thinking about all the work going on in the Gulf of Mexico and the implications it has to not only bird habitat restoration, but the bird monitoring as well. So quick little back step in time. So in April of 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster occurred. 11 fatalities and almost 5 million barrels of oil were released into the northern Gulf of Mexico, which is depicted in red here. You know, the shoreline oiling, I mean, it stretches from, or used to stretch from kind of the middle of the panhandle of Florida all the way around to East Texas. It even got up in the marshes, more specifically around Louisiana, seemed to be the biggest impact to marsh kind of loss and degradation. Lots of impacts to our wildlife resources, not only birds, but sea turtles, fisheries, the whole 9 yards, were severely impacted. Then maybe on a broader note, the settlement that came out of that spill is an equally unprecedented focus on restoration and recovery. You know, a federal judge approved just over $20 billion in the settlement for the restoration and enhancement of the Northern Gulf system. This is all being governed under what we call the PDART, the Programmatic Damage Assessment and Restoration Plan, which the short of that, it calls for holistic ecosystem restoration and monitoring. All right, so let's look a little bit deeper, thinking about it from a bird perspective. The folks at Ocean Conservancy conducted a gap analysis to see, all right, what do we know and don't know about birds and bird monitoring around the Northern Gulf? What they found was there's many existing programs, but a lot of them lacked any sort of consistency, or the coordination wasn't there. There's some large holes or gaps in what and where we're monitoring. Largely those offshore species, the pelagic environment is not being monitored very well. And we have a very disjointed kind of operating system. Everybody's kind of working in your own little box, in your own little program. Nobody's really talking to each other. And so kind of drilling that down, basically, we lack a lot of baseline data. We lack the ability to assess any sort of system drivers or management actions, especially at a large spatial scale. And there's this huge lack of coordination across the entirety of the Gulf. So what that kind of did was kind of put a task on the table for the conservation community. How do we address this disjointed, inefficient bird monitoring system? And so if we can figure that out, we'd be well served to have a strategy to, you know, so we came out of it with a coordinated and integrated approach monitoring avian resources. So from those sort of conversations and discussions, the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network was born. This network was established in early 2014, has its initial conversations in about 2013, but it really kind of got legs under it in early 2014. And so what this group is doing, basically set a vision for itself, basically the community of practice. A community of practice is basically, you know, a group of like-minded individuals working on a common topic to try to further and better that conversation. To leverage existing resources and capacities and expertise to develop and implement a coordinated and integrated bird monitoring program for the Gulf. So the short way of saying it is we got to figure out how to maximize the usefulness of our bird monitoring data so we can inform all those restoration decisions. And so kind of drilling in from more of a kind of an organizational aspect, the network established some what we call tactical objectives. And tactical means things that we can actually implement and address. So we want to provide a forum by which the monitoring community can coordinate and integrate itself. There was currently, before all this, there's really no one forum you could go to go, hey, what do I know about clapper rails in the marshes of Louisiana? Right? You had to call 4 or 5 individuals to kind of get that information. And then number 2, establish and clearly articulate core values and objectives underpinning a monitoring program. And then facilitate and implement a cost-effective regional monitoring plan. Again, kind of we got these little disjointed, we've got a project here, a project there. So how do we make project A and project B talk to each other such that the data adds up to something larger? And then to the degree plausible, attempt to get everybody using the same protocols and addressing similar metrics such that data can be added up. We fully realize that one size fits all is probably not a good approach. Meaning that one protocol is not going to answer everybody's questions, but there are some commonalities. If we all agree that we need to know, you know, abundance, and it needs to be corrected for detectability, then we start moving and everybody collects data. That facilitates data being able to roll up across the Gulf and across partners. So the fundamental issue that we kind of identified here was no one really knew who was on first, right? Everybody's got their own mandates and goals and objectives. You know, Mississippi's got an objective, Louisiana's got one, TNC has one, etc. But really, a lot of it hinges what we call in the single loop learning. I implement some management action. In this case, I'll use prescribed fire, and I monitor bird response to prescribed fire. Okay, I know the seasonalities of the burns and how the frequencies and so forth. I know how that impacts, you know, species A, B, and C. But what's often missing is why are we even doing that to start with, right? So what's making us implement the actions, and did we learn anything that helps us retune, refine our governing variables, like why we're actually doing the prescribed fire in the first place? So kind of there's some conversations that have been lost in here. Our goals and objectives were all over the board. So this slide kind of articulates that a little bit finer for you, maybe. But what do we really value? So I really want to know about wading birds and ecological processes and anthropogenic disturbances. Well, that's totally different than understanding waterfowl and natural disturbances during migration, right? So how do we get more explicit in what our goals and objectives are and what we actually value from a bird monitoring program? Well, it's pretty complex. And so this group employed structured decision making. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically rooted in the principles of decision theory. Ralph Keeney, one of the founders, kind of phrases it like this: a formalization of common sense for decision problems that are too complex for the informal use of common sense. You kind of have to read it and think about it for a second to let that one digest and sink in. Basically, just the short of it is it's kind of a structured way to break down and decouple complex situations in a very logical fashion to get primary or means objectives out of that. So using that, one of the first things you do is you put all your core people, your stakeholders, your partners in one room together, and you talk everything through. And so we had a series of these workshops over about 3 years, from Texas to Florida. And we also brought in information from every bird plan that we could get our hands on, right? Because no need reinventing the wheel. And again, this is some of that disjunct nature. We got all these plans plus some. Each one of them says and asks for something slightly different. All right, what's the commonalities here? So at the end of the day, the commonalities was kind of like what we call fundamental objectives. We need to maximize the integration of monitoring projects. Again, remember we had disjointed effort. How do we get everybody on the same page? How do we maximize the scientific rigor? And it just amazes me that we even still talk about this today. Most of y'all are still in school. You're taking the stats class right now. It's like, I got it. I know how to do statistics. I know how to do survey design. Something happens when you graduate and you work for about 2 years. Your brain gets wiped clean of all of that. I don't know how this happens. We tend to lose a lot of that scientific rigor in the day-to-day jobs. And so it's just bringing that back to the front and center of our attention. And then the relevance of monitoring projects. And so what we mean by relevance is that we're basically doing baseline information. We understand population and habitat status. How are things doing across the Gulf? And we also need to manage or maximize our understanding of our management actions. If we're going to do prescribed fire or living shorelines or build a new barrier island, what's the impacts to bird populations? And then there's also what we call ecological processes: sea level rise, storm surge, things of that sort. That's usually the noise in the data set. Back to your stats, right? You get a mean and a variance. Why did it happen like that? Or the big variance, what happened to that? That's usually these ecological processes, Mother Nature kind of wreaking havoc on your survey design. Those have to be factored in as well, so we understand those. And so taking all that kind of background information, so folks in the GoMan or the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network is then after all those workshops, spent the next 2 years basically writing a book. This is available for download off of our website. I have hard copies. If Terry will let me know, I can send you X number of copies over. I've got probably 400 out in my warehouse. I can send you 25, 50 copies. So this is where we synthesize all that information down, try to make sense of it, and provide guidance to managers moving forward. And so within the book, there's 12 chapters. A couple of chapters on the front end that articulate the who's, the what's, and the whys. Then there's a chapter on each of the taxonomic groups: land birds, marsh birds, raptors, etc. Terry helped us co-author a chapter on avian health. It's one thing to go count birds, but if you're not also worried about the physiological stressors and so forth, you know, I can build a bird island, have a lot of birds on there, but if they're in poor condition, body-wise, maybe their, you know, productivity and reproductive success is suffering because of that. And then we'll talk also a chapter about data integration and collaboration, and then some concluding comments. And each of these chapters are available on the website as individual PDF. So if you're only worried about ducks or wading birds, you don't have to get the whole report. You can just get that one chapter. Within each of those chapters, there's a series of conceptual models or influence diagrams. Here I'm just showing a quick one for black rails. Things in green are management activities. I can reduce disturbance or I can control invasives, all in an attempt to influence population size. And in the middle is these kind of tan or gold boxes, however they show up on your monitor. These are things that we need to be considering. So if we're doing prescribed fire, what's that? You know, it has impacts on vegetational height, density. That comes down to feeds through prey availabilities and so forth. So we have these for all 68 priority species identified in the plan or the guidelines. These are really helpful for designing monitoring programs, but also for designing research efforts. Like, well, what do we need to know? Where's the data gap related to black rails? Well, there's energetic conditions and prey availability and stormwater management, you know. And to kind of help you think that through a little bit, all of that's been translated into a series of tables within the guidelines. So here I'm just going to show a part of a table. This is one is for marsh birds, I believe. So there's a number of questions put forth. There's some endpoints that we suggest would be the good ones to think about to measure and monitor. And then these categories kind of is a way of prioritizing where we start working on these. So there's some of these that have really high uncertainty, and we believe they have a really high effect size, being impact to the population. So these are where we should be starting first, things that have a high impact to a population and a high uncertainty associated with it. And so from that, the intended applications of all of this, basically, you know, it's a foundational roadmap. So whether if you're a student trying to think about how to design your master's thesis or a PhD, or if I'm a funding entity, you know, I'm National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, thinking about where and how I invest my resources going forward. There's something in there in the guidelines for everyone, you know, and if we do this right, you know, it should enable some collaboration and integration, facilitate our communication, provides local managers some insight. So I was talking about if you develop an adaptive management plan, if we're building a barrier island, what are those things I need to be thinking about that could be, you know, those ecological processes that are helping drive my management decisions. So kind of jumping out of that back to a little bit bigger picture from the GoMan perspective, if you want to learn more, we have a website. It's real simple. It's just goman.org. Nearly everything I've talked about from the Gulf perspective is on here. We also have a newsletter that comes out on about a quarterly basis. You can go there and get a little bit additional insight, some of our partners and some of the projects we're working on. And so kind of bringing this kind of the totality here, wrapping it up a little bit, some greater accountability demands are placed on conservation, right? So like I said, there's $20 billion plus that's available for Gulf restoration. At some point, people are already asking, what the heck did you do with all that money? Where did it go? What did you do with it? And what did you get for your return on the dollar? And so that's kind of the biological. So if I spent, you know, $18 billion to restore our barrier island system, can we get more pelicans? What about all the tern colonies? Are they doing good? Right? So we have to have a coordinated monitoring program to be able to address and understand those sort of issues and questions. So kind of started off kind of an open question of, so what does a migratory bird biologist do? Well, we do a little bit of everything, right? So it's everything from, planning to designing studies, designing research, designing monitoring programs, GIS type work, some remote sensing work. So we have a variety of skill sets that we bring to the table. And then, well, everybody's muted, nobody can talk, but you were looking for the banded bird, which is usually my guess. A couple of banded birds in here. You see leg bands on little green there's a green one back there. But since nobody can talk or interact, I can't ask my question. Did you see the banded bird? Okay, to wrap this up, if you're interested, we would love to have you come work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Here, note this website here. I think this is being recorded, so you can get this from the recording and flip back through it. This page here has about 4 or 5 different opportunities listed. There's pathway students, there's SCEP students, there's basic intern type programs. So there's several different ways you can get involved and basically just do an intern, volunteer for the summer. Actually, be more than volunteer, you get paid. Or you can join on. We help, pay your way through school and then hire you when you come out the backside of your program. So it's a really neat opportunity to get engaged with Fish and Wildlife Service. And with that, I don't think I went super fast, but I left plenty of time for questions. And so I'll throw it back to our moderators, either Terry or Jamie, how you want to handle questions and answers.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in there yet. So maybe Dr. Manus has some questions to get us going. She has to unmute herself first.
Thanks for that. I had forgotten to unmute myself. So Randy, I just wondered, because we probably have a number of students who, are thinking about a career path, right? What do I do once I'm done with school? Certainly if doing an internship is something they could do to find out if, perhaps working for U.S. Fish and Wildlife or a government agency is for them. But could you talk a little bit about the pathway of if someone wants to work for a federal agency like U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and you've also worked for USGS? So what kind of pathways to get there?
Yeah, so the pathways, first thing, stay in school, right? So most everyone coming out now has at least a master's degree. And a lot of people have PhDs nowadays, but we hire a lot of folks with master's degrees, especially in the biological arena. And so that's always the first move. And then just finding those opportunities. I just talked about the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Mig Bird program. There's the refuge system, there's ecological services, there's the permitting stuff. There's all kinds of opportunities within the Fish and Wildlife Service. But then there's also within the Forest Service and USDA, or the Department of Ag and Wildlife Services. There's 4 or 5 or 6 federal agencies that have similar opportunities and pathways to get in through these internship programs. Or we can just advertise for what we would call like a GS 579 biologist, which is kind of an entry level position. And just apply. The key is to get in. The approach I took, I'm from East Tennessee, and I said when I got out of high school or college, I did not limit myself to working in East Tennessee. Like I said, I want a job. Right? Give me a job. And I landed in Mississippi, actually in Vicksburg, and I spent my whole career here. I moved like 30 miles down the road to Jackson. I've been really happy with that move. If I had any regrets, I didn't move around enough early on and take advantage of what the Fish and Wildlife Service and the government has to offer. Meaning that I've got colleagues that they spent 2 years in Alaska and maybe in California or Hawaii or something. You know, getting to learn a different system, see different countries, and then working yourself back home. You know, everybody kind of wants to work yourself back home. So part of the punchline is that try to get a master's degree if you can, and then when you get out, take a job wherever, right? Get exposure, get out of, if you're from Louisiana, you know, get out of Louisiana, go somewhere. You can always work yourself back, but just that exposure, that's my regret. Like I said, like I landed in Mississippi 24 years ago, and here I am still today. I don't regret a day of it, and there's benefits to that, right? Because I have long relationships. I know a lot of people and have really good working relationships. But I missed that. I should have went to California or Washington State or somewhere, right? Just to have that perspective.
If anybody has any questions, they can type them in there and we'll pose it to Randy. But one thing I did want to point out, because I've had some friends do this path, Randy mentioned getting a master's degree. And, you know, it might be daunting to consider continuing school after you graduated, but I have had some friends who had U.S. Fish and Wildlife pay for their graduate degree, and they had a job for them when they finished. And so that is a pathway that I think a lot of people aren't aware of.
That's right. And on that website that I showed, there is, oh, scroll back. Oh. Yeah, come on, right there. Ah. One more. Come on, Randy, go backwards. And stop. Yeah, so if you scroll down here, there is the Pathways program. It explains more of that. And so it is an opportunity kind of once you get in, you get accepted, right? So the service will pay for the majority of your graduate, if not all of it, your work. And then when you come out the backside, basically we're guaranteeing you a job with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so, yeah, so it might be daunting to think that, another 2 or 3 years of school. But there's opportunities to have other people pay for that. And you know you're going to have a job, you know, in the natural resource arena when you come out the backside of it. And so on that note, I will say that the job market's getting tougher every day. The federal budget seems to get shrinked every year. We've had we've either had declining or stable budgets for about the last 15 years. And even when I say stable budgets, that's really a declining budget. If you're stable and you add cost of living and price increases, inflation on top of that, right, you're really going backwards. So as a result, we have a much reduced workforce. So we're having to be really careful on which positions we fill, but there's a big push with inside of mostly the Fish and Wildlife Service, but largely other agencies. So where before we may have had a wildlife biologist that was say a GS-13 that made whatever, I don't know, $100,000 a year. Well, for that same amount of money, we can hire 2 GS-7 biologists and pay them $50,000 a year, right? So now I get 2 people that I can work with. So it's making us ask hard questions. Do I need high-level, high-paid biologists? In some cases, we do. But in a lot of cases, I just need boots on the ground to go catch the birds and band them so we get the data that we need. So there's a lot of reorganization and kind of shuffling of our workforce that's ongoing. But definitely looking at some of these new programs like these pathways, and the other one I'm not familiar with, there's SCEP and STEP. And then there's also a Director's Fellow program. So some of you may already have a master's degree. You can get into what we call the Director's Fellow program. That's like another intern where we pay you to work for us for like 11 weeks. And then we can hire you on a non-competitive basis for 2 years after graduation. So like right now, this year, I think we had 48 director fellows across the United States. So once all of those students graduate, I could hire any one of them tomorrow, just right off the street. It's not a competitive advertisement. There's a lot of benefits to going through these programs. It allows us to reach out and grab you and bring you on board.
Terry, can you see the questions there?
No, I can't.
Oh, okay. Then I'll ask some of them for you.
Oh, okay.
So there are a few questions. So one is there collaboration going on with the Gulf of Mexico restoration and monitoring with any state agencies, or is it all just federal collaboration within U.S. Fish and Wildlife?
That's an excellent question, and it's a collaboration that currently spans about 40 to 50 agencies and organizations. So it's not just Fish and Wildlife Service, it's everyone. And so there's currently representatives from all 5 Gulf states, from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida are involved, as well as several what we call NGOs, or the non-governmental organizations, Ducks Unlimited, Audubon, TNC, etc., and then other federal agencies as well. So it is a large collaborative effort. That's why we designed it. We did not want it to be just a Fish and Wildlife Service effort.
Another question for you, Randy. How do hunters affect waterfowl migration patterns and flyways?
That's a good one. So how do hunters influence migration? So it's largely believed to be through hunting pressure, right? But so if you just think about Arkansas, the Grand Prairie of Arkansas has a lot of hunting pressure. Well, if there's not sufficient sanctuary or for places for birds to go and rest and not be shot at, 12 hours a day, then they're going to move. They're going to come south to Louisiana or to Mississippi. Or they might end up in Oklahoma or Texas somewhere. But if you're continuously being harassed, you're going to move. That's just natural. So what we are encouraging and seeing a lot more of on the landscape is a lot of our refuges and state areas have it, but a lot of the private hunting clubs also have sanctuary areas that they do not hunt. So a bird has a place to go sit and rest. And the more sanctuary in an area, the longer that bird's liable to stay in that area and not move. So the wild card in all that is weather patterns. A big cold front blows through, birds are migratory. So it pushes them to the coast, it warms up, they move from the coast back to North Louisiana, to Arkansas, Missouri, right? So there's hunting pressure, but then there's also environmental parameters that's involved in that kind of migratory pattern distribution as well. So it's a hard one to get your brain wrapped around. We're still doing a lot of research on bird movements and what causes them to move from one place to another.
All right, there's a few more here. So you mentioned that there are 22 habitat-based joint ventures and 3 species-based joint ventures for the black duck, Arctic goose, and sea goose. What about these 3 species makes them the ones with their own joint ventures?
And so that's another good question. So like black ducks and Arctic geese and sea ducks, largely one is a footprint. Like black ducks kind of spans the entirety of the Atlantic flyway and then comes back up around into Canada. Sea ducks is their own thing largely. There's some I'm thinking like Alaska and so forth. So part of it's the geography, and part of it is just the species itself was in trouble, or the group of birds, like the Arctic geese populations or sea ducks collectively, the scoters and old squalls and so forth. They just warranted special attention, largely because of the populations that gotten so far down. And that's why you see like very reduced if any hunting seasons on some of those. Like black duck is one bird in the bag. Northern pintail is another one. It does not have an official joint venture associated with it, but a large part of the waterfowl community has elevated northern pintail such that it's kind of almost gotten that same level of attention and focus. because it was getting so far down the. We did not like the way the population trends and trajectories were going, and we weren't having a real good solution of what those trigger points were. And so instead of just this group working on it and that group working on it, it's like, all right, let's all work on it together. So that's the strength of it, is brings collective partnerships across a couple of joint ventures, the more geography-based ones. It forces them to work together to address that question at a larger scale.
All right, I'm going to mix it up and combine these two questions. So how did you decide on your career path, and what is your favorite type of bird to study?
How did I decide on what career path? Well, it was actually pretty easy. I love to hunt and fish and be outdoors, right? And so as soon as I knew that there was a job that we could live in doing that, I was like, all right, I'm all in. The only regret I have out of that was when I was in school, none of my advisors, even all the way through like undergraduate, told me that I could be a pilot and a biologist, because I have an inkling for aviation. And when I was younger, I tinkered on joining the military just so I could fly, fly military jets. And then they told me that unless you went to West Point, you weren't flying nothing but 747. So I kind of aborted on that thought process. But my ultimate goal would have been to a pilot biologist. Garrett Wilkinson turned out to be, right? So he's a biologist, but he's also a pilot. He gets to fly the cool aircraft. Nobody told me I could do both. And so that was a pretty easy decision there for me. And so my favorite bird group, that's a tough one because I've worked on just about everything now. Waterfowl is probably my favorite. Because you can do so much with them. You can put large satellite transmitters on them. You can color leg bands. Where a lot of the passerines are so small. Excuse me. We're getting to where technology allows satellite transmitters and stuff. But waterfowl is just, one, I like to hunt waterfowl. I enjoy watching them. Just you can do so much more research with them. Their larger body sizes, from a research and monitoring perspective. So waterfowl is probably my favorite.
So then to follow up on that one, what goes into bird banding and what determines the minimum or maximum number of migratory birds marked annually?
So I have to split that one into a couple of pieces. It depends on if we're talking about passerines. So like the Fish and Wildlife Service, in concert with U.S. Geological Survey, basically we manage a bird banding lab. So if you want to band birds, you have to get a permit from us, from the USGS folks, to be able to pass some criteria. And if you just want to ban birds, right, there's no quotas for that. So like a lot of that's for research or just banding stations. Like, there's people have been banding birds at Fort Morgan, Alabama for like 48 years. Right? They just do it every year. Everything they catch gets a band on it. There's no quota for those. Those largely inform kind of migration patterns. That was the old way of learning about migration. Putting a band on a bird, hope somebody finds it dead or shoots it and reports it. And now with all the nano tags and satellite tags, technology allows us to study migration a lot easier. The quotas really come into place in terms of like a lot of the waterfowl stuff. I spent the better part of 5 summers in Canada banding waterfowl. And so we'd set out with quotas, like we needed to do, 10,000 pintails and 10,000 mallards or whatever the number was. And we knew through some mathematical models that what the return rate is, return rate being if a hunter harvests a bird and then calls the 1-800 number. So that's how we get the harvest statistics that goes into the harvest reg setting. And so through years of research and modeling, we know what that return rate is. So we knew we had to band X number of birds to get that return rate. That's how those quotas were established, just to ensure that we had sufficient data to make all the models run for informing harvest regulation type setting exercises.
All right, then this might be the last question that'll be well timed for us to wrap it up. But has the Gulf of Mexico recovered from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill over the course of this last decade, or are there still parts of the ecosystem that are damaged?
That's a very good question. I think that if you were to ask 10 different scientists, you'd probably get the same answer. Yes, no, maybe, and we don't know. Right? And so there's definitely areas where we've done work in restoration and we can see improvements. There's definitely areas where we know that we're still kind of struggling. Some of the deep benthic organisms, a lot of that oil, when it settled out into the sand, and through storm surges and ocean currents, right, it kind of gets buried in the sand. And then the next tropical storm comes through and uncovers it, makes it available again. So that's some of the unknowns, like we don't exactly know where it all is and meant, and if it's still there or not. But definitely you can go to places in South Louisiana that were severely impacted with that onshore oiling. You'd be hard pressed to see any impacts to the vegetation today. Right? The vegetation is recovered again, but the problems are more hidden, like it disrupted food chains. We saw immediate impacts, the disruption of food webs, the loss of productivity in a number of species for a couple of years. So those are starting to rebound. So it's kind of a yes, no, maybe type answer. It depends on how you define success, right? So yep, brown pelicans are doing good. We got a lot of them now. Some of the deep benthic organisms maybe not so well. And then they're still seeing some lingering issues in some of the marine mammals, very long-lived, some dolphins and stuff, right? There's still some bioaccumulation kind of effects. It kind of rears its ugly head every now and then. So kind of depends on how you define success and which species and organisms you're kind of looking at.
Well, that's all the questions I see from the audience. I think I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that you talked about opportunities for students. That's a big reason why we do these seminars, so students can see what's out there for them. So I really appreciate that from you, Randy. Dr. Manus, do you have any other questions or comments?
No, just thank you for spending some time with us, Randy.
Yeah, thank you all for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Like I told Terry, I'm just right down the road. I mean, feel free to holler at me, and in any other time I could have gotten the truck and be there in person today, but maybe one day we'll make it happen.
Yeah, well, you offered it. We'll have you here one day in person. We can do that again for sure.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Take
Thanks,
care,
everybody.
Randy.